One of my big pet peeves is people are like, oh, your piriformis is tight. Let's do all the figure 4 stretching in the world, or let's do all the pigeon pose in the world, which is great, but also it could be better if you understood the mechanics of the piriformis a little bit better and the relationship to gait. The motion of gait, the rotational locomotion pattern, is actually created in our trunk, not our legs. Our legs amplify it. But this rotational connection, especially to the sacrum, I'm gonna grab a sacrum here. When the sacrum rotates, that's what's referred to in sacral mechanics land as a torsion. The thing that rotates it to one side is the piriformis on the opposite side. That's part of it, right? I said it's coming from the trunk, but what happens to the piriformis, and this is where like understanding its origin is helpful, the piriformis then like shortens a little bit, if that makes sense. So it rotates it that way. When you have a torsion, we'll say right torsion. So when this trunk rotates to the right, the piriformis on the left is helping that. Part of what's happening too is when you rotate to the right in that single leg stance, your hip abductors and the piriformis has to lift up the opposite side of your pelvis as it comes up and forward and rotates to the other side. So the piriformis is one of the main muscles that does that. Helps out the rotation as well as creates side bending of the side bending or lateral flexion of the spine. It does this main thing through this anterior attachment because it comes so close to the midline here on the sacrum. It along with the ilium and the glute medius and glute minimus do this action of the sacrum, and if you can imagine the rest of the spine, taking the tail to the right, so the opposite way. So it's creating contralateral lateral flexion as it then switches legs and goes to the other side. So this is sort of what your sacrum and your pelvis is doing through the gait cycle. Then it makes sense why maybe clamshells are not the only thing we can do to help strengthen this muscle or help mobilize this muscle. It is a piece of it because the muscle is more complex, and it has a lot to do with also, is the leg fixed on the ground as described of now the function through the gait cycle, or is it the leg more open chain and not fixed to the ground? When the leg is more open chain, then it's different. Now, instead of the action being on the sacrum, the action's going to be on the leg and the hip joint itself. Even when it's acting on the sacrum, it's still affecting the hip joint, obviously, because it's crossing the two, but it's a little bit more about what's happening at the spine and the pelvis versus just at the hip joint. Because now we're looking at the hip joint even in a different scenario. We're looking at pelvis on hip motion in rotation and extension and flexion versus hip or thigh on pelvis motion. When you are stretching the piriformis, instead of doing it in a figure 4, you want to make sure one thing is happening, which is the most important, and it is the thigh is crossing or on its way towards the midline. And I talked about this in that lateral line love podcast a lot, how important hip adduction was. That was the whole point of the lateral line conversation. But when we're stretching the piriformis, we want to make sure, even let's say we're stretching it in your classic like figure 4 type of stretch, you want to make sure the thigh is across the midline. This is why the pigeon pose tends to be a little bit better of a stretch for the piriformis, is because if it's done correctly, it brings the knee to the midline and it holds the knee to the midline. And that's a really important part because as you add external rotation to stretch the piriformis, if they're tight, oftentimes you'll see their thigh drift away from the midline. And this is like a game, like a teeter-totter game, which is why you got to hold one side still. Now, to further improve the stretch, he suggested adding in trunk or pelvic lateral flexion with a hip hike. So when you're stretching the piriformis, let's say you're stretching the right, we're bringing the right leg to the midline at 90 degrees of hip flexion or above, then adding external rotation of the thigh, and then we're hip hiking to the same side. What this hip hike does is it basically creates a contract, relax, or a hold, relax type of PNF situation and helps us to sort of inhibit the piriformis by this antagonist-agonist relationship that the QL has with the piriformis.